There are moments in the human story when the silence feels heavier than the words we still remember. Layers of dust cling to tablets that should have spoken clearly, yet their meanings slip like water through the hands of time. And somewhere in that dimness, the Sumerians left warnings. Fragments of an origin we once carried but can no longer fully recall. Perhaps it was never truly lost, just quietly folded away, beneath the stories we were told to accept. Tonight, let us lean closer to those ancient whispers and walk together into what might have been forgotten. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history, and if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There is a quiet contradiction at the centre of Sumerian history, a contradiction so subtle that most readers pass over it without a second thought. It begins with the simple fact that the earlier Sumerian cities seemed to rise not gradually, not step by step from primitive villages, but fully formed, with written language, administration, mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and a social complexity that should have required thousands of years of development. Yet in the archaeological layers beneath them, the expected staircase of cultural evolution grows strangely faint. Instead, the remains of earlier settlements feel like shadows, disconnected fragments that do not convincingly explain the sudden brilliance that followed. And from this gap, questions begin to widen, like cracks spreading across a tablet long buried beneath the earth. Some Sumerian texts seem to acknowledge this strangeness in their own way. They speak of the days before the kingship descended from heaven, an age when the world was not yet arranged, when civilization was not yet given its shape. The phrase, descended from heaven, has been interpreted metaphorically as the divine sanction of kingship, yet the Sumerians often describe their gods with unsettling specificity, not merely as celestial archetypes, but as beings who travelled, commanded, taught, punished, and built. Their presence in the myths is not vague but deliberate, and again the texts return to the theme of something given, something transferred to humanity from another order of existence. Knowledge did not grow, it arrived. Guidance was not discovered, it was bestowed. But what exactly was bestowed? And by whom? Here the clay tablets fall into silence or poetry, and scholars have argued for centuries over their meaning. Some see the descriptions as mythic storytelling, the imaginative attempt of early people to explain the world around them. Others argue that the precision of certain terms, particularly in astronomy and mathematics, suggests that the stories encode memories of real events, filtered through the symbolic language of myth. There is no consensus, and yet the questions hang unresolved. How did humanity leap so suddenly into written history? And why do the Sumerians attribute their knowledge to beings who came from the sky? It is in this uneasy space that the idea of a warning begins to emerge. Sumerian texts often speak of knowledge lost, of wisdom taken away, of disruptions that severed humanity from what it once knew. One of the most haunting lines appears in a hymn associated with Inanna: "The bright me of the black-headed people was taken, and they forgot." Scholars differ on the exact translation, but the implication remains unsettling. The me, the divine decrees that govern order, creativity, civilization, and human identity, was somehow removed, and humanity slipped into a kind of sleep. To forget is not merely to lose information. It is to drift away from a former state of understanding. Was this forgetting natural, the result of wars, migrations, or environmental collapse? Or did something, or someone, intervene? The tablets never say clearly. They leave only hints, shadows of events only half preserved. And in those shadows, the first thread of the warning begins to appear. When Enki, the god of wisdom, shaped humanity from the clay, the texts say he did so to bear the yoke of the gods. This detail disturbs many readers, for it portrays human consciousness not as a miracle of nature, but as a functional necessity, a tool created to perform labour. Yet the same texts describe Enki as the protector of humanity, the one who intervened repeatedly to preserve human life against the severity of Enlil, who found humans too noisy, too numerous, too restless. The watershed moment, of course, is the flood, the great deluge whose echoes appear not only in Sumer, but in the traditions of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil's irritation becomes divine policy. reduce humanity, shorten their lifespan, strip away their memory. The language is chillingly administrative, as though these were not gods but managers of an unruly species. If this is merely myth, then it reflects the deep anxieties of early civilizations, the sense of vulnerability before natural disasters, the fear of divine displeasure. But if even a fragment of it preserves an ancestral memory, then the implications are far more troubling. A deliberate reduction, a designed limitation, an intentional forgetting. These are the themes that return again and again, like distant echoes from a story whose first half has been erased. Archaeology offers no proof of such deliberate erasures, yet it too speaks of disruptions. The Uruk collapse around 3200 BCE remains a mystery. Cities emptied, trade networks dissolved, monumental construction ceased. Some explain it through climate change, others through warfare or internal strain, yet none of the causes fully account for the scale and speed of the transformation. After this rupture, civilization re-emerges, but altered, fragmented, diminished. Something had shifted. The light of early Sumer seemed to flicker, then return in another form, as though memory itself had been partially rewritten. Linguists have also puzzled over the Sumerian language, whose origins remain unknown. It is a language isolate, unrelated to Semitic, Indo-European, or any other known family. Its structure is so distinct that scholars cannot trace it to earlier stages. It appears suddenly, already complex, already fully formed, with no identifiable ancestors. This alone invites questions. Languages evolve gradually over long periods. They do not simply emerge from the dust, perfectly articulated, and yet Sumerian does exactly that. What is even stranger is that certain Sumerian terms describing astronomical cycles, such as the Sar and Ner time units, align with long count measurements far exceeding the practical needs of early city-states. Some researchers have argued that these measures reflect observations of precessional cycles or other slow celestial rhythms that require centuries of continuous data. Others dismiss this as coincidence or misinterpretation. But the question lingers. How did a people at the dawn of urban life possess concepts tied to cycles longer than their recorded history? Perhaps the most enigmatic of all is the Sumerian king list, a document that blends history and myth so seamlessly that scholars still disagree on how to interpret it. It lists kings who ruled for impossibly long spans, thousands, even tens of thousands of years, before the flood. After the deluge, the lifespans shrink to human scale. Traditionally, these vast ages are assumed to be symbolic, reflecting the divine nature of early kings. Yet the list is written with the same matter-of-fact tone that it applies to later, historically attested rulers. It does not signal where myth ends and history begins. It simply records, as though preserving a memory rather than composing a legend. Some scholars note that the long reigns resemble calculations derived from older numerical systems. Others argue that they encode cosmological cycles, not actual lifetimes. Still others propose that the numbers might preserve distorted memories of earlier periods of human organization long before writing. No interpretation satisfies everyone. The king list stands as a puzzle, a memory of something extraordinary, carefully preserved in clay, but no longer understood. If the Sumerians were trying to warn future generations of something, perhaps it lies in this blend of forgetting and remembering, this sense that humanity once possessed knowledge now beyond its grasp. The texts repeatedly hint at lost epochs, at disruptions that broke the chain of memory. They speak of guidance withdrawn, of connections severed, of wisdom that once flowed freely but now reaches us only as echoes. Even the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld, often read as an allegory of fertility cycles, contains a troubling motif: knowledge taken, silence imposed, the world plunged into stillness until balance is restored. The pattern of a fall and a return recurs across multiple myths, as though Sumerian culture was haunted by the memory of something precious lost and only partially regained. One of the most intriguing clues comes from early administrative tablets. Among the records of grain deliveries, livestock and trade goods, scholars have found symbols whose meanings remain uncertain. Some appear to represent categories of knowledge, musical, architectural, medical, that seem too advanced for the period. Others resemble schematic diagrams, though their purpose is unknown, A few tablets contain geometric markings that some researchers believe could be related to early observational astronomy. None of these inscriptions form full treatises. Instead, they feel like fragments, as though the complete knowledge lay elsewhere, now vanished. And then there is the problem of the sudden disappearance of certain technologies. The Sumerians developed remarkable techniques, including early forms of bronze working, advanced ceramics, and surprisingly sophisticated surveying methods that later cultures in the region seem to forget, then rediscover centuries later. Cultural loss happens, of course, but the repeated cycles of innovation, disappearance, and reappearance suggest a deeper instability, as though written history stands atop older layers of knowledge that were fractured again and again. We also see this pattern in the city of Eridu, considered the oldest in Sumerian tradition. Archaeological layers show repeated construction and destruction, with each level revealing shifts in architectural style, religious practice, and social organization. Some of these shifts correspond to natural disasters, others remain unexplained. The pattern is reminiscent of a memory rewritten, of a civilization trying repeatedly to restore something it barely remembered. Modern scholars tend to avoid such interpretations, preferring explanations grounded in environmental change or political upheaval. Yet the Sumerians themselves framed their past in terms of divine intervention, forgotten wisdom, and sudden transformations. Their worldview may not align with modern assumptions, but it hints at an underlying narrative, that humanity's origins are older, more complex, and more deliberately shaped than we typically imagine. One wonders whether the Sumerians saw themselves as inheritors of a world whose true beginning lay far beyond their own time, a world shaped by beings or forces they could describe only through the language of gods. Their myths read like attempts to preserve memories that were already slipping away, to encode warnings in stories and symbols that might survive the erosion of time. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: what exactly did they believe needed to be warned against? Was it the danger of forgetting, of losing the knowledge that once connected humanity to the larger cosmos? Was it the risk of repeating ancient mistakes, of cycles of hubris and collapse? Or was it something else entirely? Something about the origins of humanity that they believed future generations would need to uncover for themselves? The tablets offer no clear answer. They speak in fragments, in poetry, in riddles. And yet the warning lingers between the lines, murmuring through the cracks in the clay. It is the sense that we are walking through the ruins of a story whose first chapters have been removed, leaving us to piece together the truth from what remains. And just when one thinks the story is starting to become clear, another tablet appears, another fragment surfaces, and the path forward dissolves again into uncertainty. But perhaps uncertainty was the point. Perhaps the warning was never meant to be delivered plainly. Perhaps it was meant to draw the listener deeper, to invite them to question, to notice the absences as much as the words preserved on the clay. After all, the Sumerians lived in a world where truth was layered, where the seen and unseen interlocked, where wisdom came not simply from learning, but from listening. And as we lean closer to those ancient whispers, we begin to sense a larger pattern, not a conclusion, but an opening. For every answer the tablets seem to offer, they present two new questions, as though guiding us step by step towards something hidden just beyond the threshold of understanding. Across the shifting landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, there is a recurring theme that scholars mention only cautiously: the awareness, within Sumerian texts, that humanity was not the first to walk the earth in its current form. It is a theme woven quietly through hymns, administrative tablets, rituals, and myths, and though never declared openly, it pulses like a faint heartbeat beneath the surface. One finds it in subtle phrases, references to the people before the people, to those who were fashioned and those who were refashioned, to the ones who knew the words before the words were spoken. These expressions are easy to dismiss as poetic flourishes, yet they return with such consistency across different periods that they demand a closer look. And when one leans in, the ancient warning grows a little clearer. The theme appears most clearly in the tales surrounding the me, the sacred decrees of civilization, the building blocks of order, creativity, and human identity. Modern readers often interpret the me as a list of cultural achievements: kingship, weaving, herbal knowledge, music, metallurgy. But in Sumerian thought, the me were more than skills. They were the invisible principles behind skills, cosmic patterns that shaped human potential. The strange thing is that many texts speak of the me not as inventions, but as restorations, not as something new, but as something remembered, reclaimed, or returned after being lost. In the time before, the me were scattered, says one fragment. In the days after, they were gathered again. This language, if taken seriously, hints at a cycle of civilization, a rise, a fall, and a renewal. It suggests that the Sumerians believed they were not the beginning of the story, but inheritors of an older world that had once held knowledge now vanished. The idea fits uneasily with our modern narrative of linear progress. Yet archaeology increasingly reveals that human history has been punctuated by abrupt collapses, forgotten technologies, and sudden renaissances whose causes remain unclear. The Sumerians may have been describing in mythic language what geology and climatology now call civilizational bottlenecks, periods when humanity nearly disappeared, only to rise again. One of the most intriguing sites in this regard is Göbekli Tepe, far to the northwest of ancient Sumer. Though not Sumerian, it predates the earliest Sumerian cities by millennia, and yet displays architectural sophistication that should not have been possible for a Stone Age society. Massive T-shaped pillars, intricate carvings, aligned enclosures, a level of symbolic and engineering complexity that arrives suddenly, with no clear precursors. It suggests that the memory of a forgotten world might have been preserved in human hands, carried forward across ages of darkness. Though the Sumerians never mention Göbekli Tepe directly, their myths of an earlier age of wisdom resonate with its existence. They imply that our origins might extend deeper into time than we grasp, that the first chapters of humanity's story lie beyond the boundaries of written memory. The Sumerians themselves held dim recollections of distant eras. They spoke of antediluvian kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, of cities whose bricks were laid by the first ones, of places built when the world was young. Some of these references may be symbolic, yet others appear in contexts where symbolism seems unlikely. Administrative lists, for example, occasionally refer to objects or rituals from before the flood, as though certain traditions had survived across an unfathomable gulf of time. The flood, in Sumerian accounts, marks the dividing line between eras, the moment when the old world was destroyed and the new world began. But what exactly was destroyed, and why? The texts provide two types of answers. One set describes divine displeasure. Humanity was too loud, too numerous, too restless. Another set hints at a more complex cause, that the balance between the gods had shifted, that knowledge had been misused, that something in the order of the cosmos had gone awry. The warning embedded in these tales is ambiguous but unmistakable. Disruption follows excess, collapse follows imbalance, forgetting follows hubris. The idea that knowledge can be dangerous is not unique to Sumer, of course. But the Sumerians frame this danger not as the pursuit of forbidden truths, but the loss of contextual wisdom, the idea that the me must be handled with care, that certain forms of knowledge require guidance. When Inanna steals the me from Enki, she does so impulsively, and chaos erupts across the world. When Enki retrieves them, order slowly returns. The story reads like an allegory of cultural transmission, that knowledge without understanding can fracture a world. This is perhaps why so many Sumerian myths emphasize the role of intermediaries, figures who move between realms, carrying knowledge from the divine to the human. Enki in particular appears as a mediator, a guardian of the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds. His temple in Eridu was described as the house of the subterranean waters, a place where wisdom flowed up from the depths. The imagery is rich with symbolism, knowledge emerging from darkness, truth rising from hidden places. Yet it also resonates with archaeological findings at Eridu, where the earliest temples appear not as grand monuments, but as humble shrines built atop the ruins of older shrines, layer upon layer, as though preserving a memory too ancient to articulate. Scholars have long debated whether Eridu, which the Sumerians considered the first city, was truly the cradle of civilization. But even the earliest layers show signs of deliberate construction, standardized measurements, careful alignments that imply an underlying blueprint. It is not a chaotic emergence, but a structured one, and throughout its history, Eridu remained associated with the preservation of ancient knowledge. Some texts even call it the the place where the wisdom of the old world was kept. The phrase is purely mythic, yet one wonders whether it conceals the memory of older traditions carried into Sumer by unknown ancestors. Those ancestors remain a mystery. Genetic studies indicate that the population of ancient Mesopotamia was a mixture of local hunter-gatherers, farmers from the west and migrants from the east. The blend is complex, inconsistent with a single origin. This complexity may reflect waves of movement following climatic upheavals during the Younger Dryas and early Holocene, when sea levels rose dramatically and vast regions of land were submerged. It is during this period that the Sumerian flood myths may find their real-world counterpart. Not a single catastrophic deluge, but a long series of regional floods that erased coastlines and displaced communities. If Sumer inherited fragments of older cultures, then the warning in their texts gains new meaning. It becomes not a theological message but a historical memory, that civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again, that knowledge survives only in fragments, that the past is never as complete as it seems, and perhaps, beneath the myths of divine intervention, there lies an older truth, that humanity has been shaped by cycles of creation and destruction, far more ancient than recorded history allows. Another layer of the warning appears in their astronomy. The Sumerians tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision, charting the paths of planets, stars, and lunar cycles. Their division of the sky into zones that later informed Babylonian and Greek systems suggests continuity rather than invention. But how did such advanced astronomical knowledge emerge so early? Some scholars propose that Sumer inherited observational traditions from pre-agricultural groups who spent generations tracking the stars. Others argue that the earliest urban priests developed astronomy to manage agriculture and ritual. Both explanations have merit, yet both struggle to account for the complexity present in the earliest tablets. The mystery deepens when we consider their mathematical system. The base 60 sexagesimal structure used by the Sumerians is unique, elegant, and deeply sophisticated. It allows for easy division into multiple factors, making it ideal for calendrical and astronomical calculations. Yet its origins are unknown. Why 60? Why not 10 or 12 or 20 like other ancient cultures? The system appears abruptly, fully functional, with no earlier developmental stages preserved. It is as though it was introduced into the world rather than slowly invented. The warning within these mathematical and astronomical achievements is subtle. It suggests that we may have lost the context in which this knowledge arose. The Sumerians preserved the methods, the numbers, the symbols. But did they preserve the meaning? Were they following formulas passed down from an older age whose purpose they no longer fully understood? And if so, what happened to the civilization that first developed these patterns? One clue lies in the recurring Sumerian idea of the tablets of destiny, cosmic inscriptions that determine the order of the world. These tablets are not mere metaphors. They are described as physical objects held by gods, contested in struggles that threaten cosmic stability. When the tablets fall into the wrong hands, disorder spreads across the heavens and the earth. When they are restored, balance returns. The imagery may be mythic, but the symbolism is striking. Knowledge as power, knowledge as threat, knowledge as the fulcrum of human fate. What if these stories preserve the memory of lost archives, records kept by earlier peoples, perhaps destroyed in floods or wars, whose fragments the Sumerians inherited? It is not an impossible idea. Archaeology teaches us that ancient libraries existed long before we might expect. At Ebla, thousands of tablets were stored systematically in a palace archive. At Ugarit, a sophisticated scriptorium trained scribes in multiple languages. Even earlier, at sites like Tel Brak, evidence suggests the existence of administrative centres that kept records on clay and possibly on perishable media now lost. If such archives existed before the rise of Sumer, then the Sumerian claim to inherit ancient wisdom gains a new layer of plausibility, and the warning becomes more concrete. The past is fragile, and the structures that preserve knowledge can vanish with startling speed. Another thread of the warning appears in the myth of Adapa, a figure often described as the first sage, created by Enki and endowed with extraordinary wisdom. In the tale, Adapa breaks the wing of the south wind, is summoned to heaven, and is offered the food of life, which he refuses because Enki warns him it is poison. In refusing, Adapa loses the chance to gain eternal life. The story is sometimes interpreted as an allegory of human mortality, yet it also contains a more subtle message: that human limitations were imposed, not inherent, that wisdom and longevity were once within reach, but withheld. The theme echoes the Atrahasis epic, where human lifespan is reduced after the flood to prevent humanity from growing too powerful or too numerous. Why would early civilizations imagine such constraints? Perhaps because they sensed a decline in longevity, in vitality, in connection to the natural world, that they could not explain. Perhaps they believed they had fallen from an earlier state, and the myth served as a way to articulate that loss. Modern science, too, speaks of a decline, not metaphysical but biological. Studies of ancient skeletons show that early agricultural societies experienced a deterioration in health compared to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Teeth, bones, stature all indicate that something was lost when humans transitioned to settled life. The Sumerians may have observed similar patterns in their own communities, translating the biological decline into mythic language. A loss of vitality, a shortening of life, a dimming of memory. The warning in these myths may be less about divine punishment and more about human fragility. The idea that progress can carry hidden costs, that civilizations can lose as much as they gain. Yet the most profound layer of the Sumerian warning may lie not in the stories they told, but in the silences, in what the tablets do not say, in what has been erased or never recorded. The absence of transitional artifacts between pre-urban settlements and early city-states, the disappearance of certain technologies, the unexplained collapses, the linguistic isolation of Sumerian, the strangely advanced knowledge encoded in early texts, all suggest that the origins of civilization may be tangled, interrupted, and far older than our surviving records imply. It is as though humanity is looking at its reflection in a cracked mirror, seeing fragments of a face, glimpses of a form, but never the full image. The Sumerian warnings invite us to consider what lies in the fractures, the forgotten origins, the buried foundations, the echoes of civilizations erased by time or disaster. And as one moves deeper into these mysteries, a larger question begins to surface. Quietly, insistently. If the Sumerians were inheritors of a story already half lost, then what might be missing from our own understanding of the human past? What truths lie behind the fragments we possess? What remains hidden in the ruins we have not yet uncovered, in the layers of silt that cover ancient coastlines, in the oral traditions that stretch into prehistory? The Sumerian tablets offer no definitive answer. They gesture toward a forgotten world, hint at disruptions, acknowledge losses, and whisper warnings. But they do not resolve the mystery. Instead, they leave us suspended in a space between knowing and unknowing, a space that invites deeper listening, and somewhere in that space another fragment of the old story stirs, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to lead us further into a history that does not end where we thought it began. There is a moment in the study of Sumerian history when one realizes that the mystery is not only in what the tablets preserve, but in how they survive at all. Clay endures, yes, far better than papyrus or leather, but the survival of texts is never accidental. What is written reflects what mattered enough to be inscribed, catalogued, sealed, and stored. And what was not written, the knowledge passed orally, the rituals whispered, the memories carried from an age before writing. Those things form a second shadow archive, one that must be reconstructed from hints, metaphors, and the spaces between the lines. It is within that shadow archive that the deeper Sumerian warning seems to take shape, emerging not as a single message, but as a pattern that grows sharper with every layer of inquiry. The first clue lies in what the Sumerians chose to preserve most carefully. Lists, genealogies, king lists, sequences of laws, accounting records, long series of names and numbers. To a modern reader, they feel dry, utilitarian, devoid of poetry. Yet in a world where memory itself was fragile, lists served as anchors to a past that was slipping away. They were a means of preserving continuity in an age haunted by discontinuity. And among these lists, none is more enigmatic than the Sumerian king list. We often imagine that this document is merely a mix of myth and history, but its structure is too deliberate for such a simple description. It begins with impossible reigns, tens of thousands of years, but these reigns are itemized with a precision that feels more like recording than inventing. After the flood, the reigns collapse into humanly plausible spans. Some of these post-flood kings are archaeologically attested, others are not, yet the list treats them all with the same matter-of-fact tone, as though preserving a memory without fully understanding it. This raises a troubling question. Were the Sumerians copying an older tradition, one that had already lost its original meaning? The idea grows more plausible when we consider that the earliest versions of the list appear in multiple cities, Kish, Ur, Shuruppak, each with slight variations, as though copied from a common source no longer extant. Fragmentary evidence suggests the existence of an earlier oral prototype, perhaps dating back to a time before writing itself. If so, the list may be the faint remnant of a far older chronicle, one that recorded events from a period now buried beneath millennia of sediment. What kind of world would leave behind such a chronicle, and what catastrophe erased its memory so thoroughly that only fragments remained? The flood is the obvious candidate, but even that event is difficult to pin down. Geological research reveals multiple floods in Mesopotamian prehistory, regional inundations, river avulsions, abrupt shifts in climate. The flood layer at sites like Shuruppak and Kish is real, thick deposits of silt suggesting sudden destruction. But these layers differ in date and severity. It seems unlikely that a single flood wiped out all early settlements. Instead, there were many floods, spread over centuries, a long period of instability, environmental upheaval, and displacement. It is within this turbulence that the memory of an older world may have dissolved. Yet the Sumerians speak not of many floods, but of one, a catastrophic deluge that rebooted history. Why would they compress centuries of upheaval into a single narrative? Perhaps because trauma often folds time, merging many events into one symbolic moment. Or perhaps because the older world truly did end in a way that the survivors perceived as total. A rising sea would appear gradual to us, measurable and predictable. But to people living in river valleys and coastal plains, even moderate rises in sea level would cause chaos, erasing villages, salinizing farmland, driving migrations. The transformation could feel apocalyptic, even if it unfolded across generations. In that light, the Sumerian flood myth reads not as fiction, but as cultural memory transformed into story, a warning encoded in narrative form. The message is subtle. Civilizations can vanish, knowledge can drown, and only fragments survive. Another layer of warning emerges when we examine the Sumerian understanding of time. Their conception of cycles, not only in astronomy but in history, reflects a worldview in which epochs rise and fall in patterned sequences. They believed that the gods withdrew and returned, that wisdom flowed and diminished, that human potential expanded and contracted. This rhythmic sense of time resonates with other ancient traditions, Egyptian, Vedic, Mesoamerican, each describing earlier ages that ended in catastrophe, followed by rebirth. Modern scholarship typically classifies such legends as mythological frameworks, but their global consistency raises deeper questions. If every ancient civilization imagines earlier ages of greater knowledge or longevity, are they describing a universal psychological longing? Or are they recalling dim memories of real events, passed down across millennia, distorted yet persistent? The Sumerians appear to have wrestled with this question. Their myths repeatedly describe the loss of knowledge, not as a metaphor but as an event. The withdrawal of the me, the severing of divine human contact, the shortening of lifespan. These themes suggest an awareness that humanity had declined from a former state. They are not tales of ascent but of descent. And descent is rarely the preferred narrative of a culture at the peak of its power, unless it arises from something deeply rooted. One of the most intriguing examples of this descent motif appears in the story of Enmakar and the Lord of Aratta. On the surface, it is a political tale about rival cities, but embedded within it is a curious passage, a reference to a time when humanity spoke a single language. The idea predates the biblical Tower of Babel story, and may reflect an older, Near Eastern tradition about linguistic unity followed by fragmentation. What is striking is the implication that the fragmentation was not natural but decreed, that something or someone imposed division upon humanity, fracturing a prior unity. Linguists do not take such myths literally, of course, but they do acknowledge that human language once had common ancestors, proto-languages from which all others evolved. Yet the speed and pattern of early linguistic diversification remain subjects of debate. The Sumerian myth, if read symbolically, suggests that linguistic fragmentation was associated with a loss of mutual understanding, perhaps even with the collapse of older social networks following environmental or political upheaval. In that sense, the story is not about divine punishment but collective forgetting, another fragment of the larger warning. The same pattern appears in their mystical traditions. The Sumerians believed that certain forms of knowledge, particularly astronomical, medical, and ritual knowledge, were easily corrupted if separated from their original context. Without proper lineage or instruction, knowledge could twist into harm. This belief was not unique to Sumer. Early civilizations across the world echoed the idea that the misuse of knowledge could bring disaster. But in Sumer, the emphasis was unusually strong, as though they had witnessed such misuse firsthand. The myth of civilization being restored rather than created supports this idea. If the Sumerians believed they were rebuilding a world that had once existed, then the warnings in their myths may reflect not only fear of future collapse, but memory of past collapse. The idea gains weight when we consider that early Sumerian cities show signs of advanced organization, but also sudden disruptions. Uruk, Eridu, and Shuruppak all experienced abrupt transitions, shifts in population, and unexplained breaks in their cultural continuity. Some of these breaks correspond to climatic events, but others remain mysterious. One particularly puzzling phenomenon is the disappearance of early proto-writing symbols between the late Uruk period and the early dynastic era. The earliest proto-writing consists of pictograms and numerical tokens used for accounting and ritual purposes. But many of these early symbols vanish abruptly, replaced by more standardized cuneiform forms. Why did this transition occur so suddenly? Was it simply a natural evolution? Or did it reflect a deeper rupture? A loss of the earlier symbolic system forgotten during a period of upheaval? Some scholars have proposed that early proto-writing was closely tied to ritual and sacred knowledge, and when political structures shifted, the old system was deliberately replaced with a more secular script. Others argue that the transition reflects the centralization of power, but a third possibility, rarely discussed, is that the earlier system encoded knowledge whose meaning was lost, and the new system emerged to accommodate a world that no longer remembered the old one. If so, the transition represents another instance of collective forgetting. The Sumerians themselves were acutely aware of forgetting. Their scribes often lamented the loss of older texts, the disappearance of earlier songs, the vanishing of rituals once known. In one lamentation, a priest writes, "The words have faded, the old paths are broken, who will speak the names that were once known?" It is a striking admission from a culture renowned for its record-keeping. To confess that the earlier tradition was already fading suggests that the break between ages was deeper than we typically assume. These laments deepen the sense that the Sumerians perceived their civilization as a faint echo of something older. They saw themselves as custodians, not originators, and their myths repeatedly warn that the cycle of forgetting could happen again, that knowledge could vanish, that order could collapse, that humanity could once more slip into darkness. The warning becomes sharper when we examine the myth of the seven sages, the Apkallu, who were sent by the gods in the earliest days to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These sages appear not as gods but as intermediaries, beings who travelled between realms. In later Mesopotamian tradition, the 7 antediluvian sages are contrasted with 7 post-flood sages whose powers and wisdom are diminished. The contrast suggests a decline across the flood, a loss of original completeness. Even more intriguing, the Apkallu myths describe the earlier sages as fish-cloaked beings who emerge from the waters to deliver knowledge. Some interpret this literally, others see it as symbolic, referencing the watery abyss, the domain of Enki from which wisdom flows. Either way, the imagery is ancient, persistent, and echoed in other cultures. Greek myths of sea-born teachers, Indian tales of Manu rescued by a fish, Oans in Babylonian lore, all reflect a deep theme. Knowledge emerging from the depths, lost during catastrophe, restored imperfectly in later ages. If these stories encode memories of real individuals, early cultural innovators, founders of cities, carriers of forgotten traditions, then the fish cloak imagery may symbolize their journey across water. Some researchers propose that rising seas at the end of the last ice age displaced coastal peoples who carried their knowledge inland. The Sumerians may have preserved their memory in mythic form, And the warning embedded within these myths may be this: civilization is fragile, easily washed away by forces beyond human control. Another warning emerges from the realm of Sumerian ritual. Their ceremonies often involved reenacting cosmic events, not as symbolic theatre, but as acts of maintenance, restoring balance between heaven and earth. The belief was simple, but profound. The world is not self-sustaining. It requires attention, memory, and alignment. If the rituals failed, the world could slip into disorder. This view reflects a deeply felt vulnerability, a sense that civilization is always on the edge of collapse. It is not difficult to imagine that such beliefs arose from surviving earlier disasters. The most haunting expression of this vulnerability appears in the lamentation over the destruction of Uruk. Though composed much later than the earliest myths, it retains ancient motifs, cities destroyed not merely by human hands, but by cosmic forces, wisdom scattered, rituals broken, the connection to the divine severed. The lament speaks of the bonds between heaven and earth being cut, of the protective spirits departing, of knowledge turning to dust. It is written in the tone of memory, not only of the destruction of Uruk, but of older destructions that shaped the Sumerian psyche. As one reads these laments, a troubling pattern emerges. The Sumerians never saw collapse as an isolated event. They saw it as part of a larger cycle, one that had occurred before and would occur again. And embedded within this cyclic worldview is a warning, not simply about disaster, but about the deeper danger of losing the memory of what once was. The greatest losses they imply are not cities or monuments, but knowledge. When knowledge is lost, the world becomes dimmer, narrower, less connected to its origins. And without origins, a civilization becomes unmoored, vulnerable to the next upheaval. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians preserved their myths so carefully, not as dogma, but as reminders. They understood that stories are the vessels of memory, and memory is the foundation of identity. To forget the past is to risk repeating it, and yet, for all their efforts, they too became part of the cycle. Their cities fell, their language faded, their stories survived only in fragments. The very pattern they warned about eventually consumed them, but their warnings remain, carved into clay, embedded in myth, whispered through time. And as we follow the threads of these warnings, we move closer to the heart of the ancient message, that humanity's origins may be older, more complex and more fragile than we imagine, that we live in the shadow of forgotten ages, that the present rests upon layers of memory at risk of vanishing, and as the last lines of their myths hint, with a subtlety both poetic and unsettling, what has been forgotten once can be forgotten again. There is a strange moment in the study of ancient civilizations when evidence begins to feel less like a record of the past and more like the remnant of another mind, a pattern of thought we can sense but not fully decipher. Sumer, more than any other early culture, gives us this feeling. Its symbols are precise, yet elusive. Its myths are vivid, yet enigmatic. Its cities rise abruptly, as if guided by hands already accustomed to the logic of walls, canals, and temples. And throughout its texts, there is an undercurrent of tension, as though the Sumerians sensed they were standing atop a world whose true foundations lay far deeper than their own memory. This feeling becomes more unsettling when one examines the technological and intellectual advances of early Sumer. For a civilization at the dawn of history, their achievements are disproportionately sophisticated. They mastered irrigation networks that required advanced hydrological knowledge. They developed administrative systems that resemble modern bureaucratic frameworks. They produced astronomical observations that align closely with later Babylonian and even Greek calculations. They built temples with precise alignments and foundations laid through rituals that combined mathematics with cosmology. Yet at the same time, many of their technological and architectural forms appear without clear developmental stages. It is as if the Sumerians began not at the beginning of a process, but in the middle of one. The standard narratives of anthropology and archaeology attempt to explain this through gradual evolution, a long chain of incremental improvements now mostly lost to time. But the archaeological record grows thinner the further back we go. Villages that should have shown early stages of complexity remain modest. Tools and artifacts that should have indicated developing craftsmanship are absent or appear suddenly in advanced form. And the symbolic systems, proto-writing, seals, administrative tokens, show little evidence of early experimentation. they emerge almost fully realized. In this absence of visible precursors, a question arises. Did the Sumerians themselves know that they were inheriting something? Did they realize that the knowledge they used daily was not entirely their own? Their myths suggest they did. The idea that civilization was given, not invented, that kingship descended from heaven, that wisdom was preserved from an earlier age. These themes are too consistent to ignore. It may be mythic phrasing, but myth often carries memory, especially in cultures where oral tradition predates writing. One of the most compelling examples of inherited knowledge lies in their metrology, their system of weights and measures. The Sumerian system is extraordinarily complex, involving multiple interlocking units that form a coherent mathematical structure. Yet this structure appears suddenly, without transitional forms. It is as if the Sumerians adopted a pre-existing system rather than creating one from scratch. Some researchers have suggested that such systems may have been derived from older trading networks across Mesopotamia and Anatolia. But even this explanation requires an earlier, highly organized framework, one we have not yet uncovered. This absence of origin is mirrored in their religious architecture. Temples in Sumer, the ziggurats and earlier shrine platforms, are built upon successively older foundations, each level carefully preserving the footprint of the previous one. Even when the city around them changed, the sacred precincts retained their ancient layout, as though honouring a plan whose meaning had long been forgotten. Archaeologists have noted that early temple designs show signs of being inherited from older traditions, yet the origin of those traditions remains unknown. The continuity is undeniable, but its source is obscured. If the Sumerians were aware of this obscurity, they expressed it through myth. The story of Inanna travelling to Eridu to obtain the me from Enki is one such example. It describes the retrieval of ancient wisdom from the oldest city, wisdom that had been hidden or lost or withheld. When Inanna brings the me to Uruk, she brings civilization itself. Laws, arts, rituals, crafts, knowledge. The story reads like an allegory of cultural inheritance, the younger city receiving the wisdom of an older one. Yet beneath the allegory lies a deeper question. Where did Eridu's wisdom come from? The text offers no answer. It merely states that the me were the property of the gods, given in a time before humanity's memory. This time before memory is not unique to Sumer. Nearly every ancient civilization speaks of an earlier age, an age of gods, sages, ancestors, or forgotten peoples. In Egypt, it is the Zep Tepi, the first time. In India, the Yugas describe cycles of rise and decline. In the Andes, the stories of Viracocha speak of a time before the sun rose in the sky. In Mesoamerica, the Maya describe earlier epochs destroyed by flood and fire, and in each case, the present world is portrayed not as the beginning of history, but as a reconstruction of something older, diminished, or partially lost. The Sumerians mirror this pattern with unusual clarity. Their myths do not celebrate the birth of civilization as a simple, linear progression. Instead, they portray it as a recovery, a restoration of order after chaos, a gathering of scattered knowledge. This idea appears explicitly in texts that describe the rebuilding of cities after the flood. Kings are said to restore the rights of old, re-establish the ways of the fathers, recover the lost knowledge. These phrases suggest a consciousness of loss, and of the need to repair what has been broken. If we take these fragments seriously, the Sumerian warning becomes sharper. Humanity is prone to forgetting, and the forgetting is often catastrophic. Knowledge is not guaranteed to endure. It must be tended, protected, preserved. When the chain of transmission breaks, civilizations collapse into darkness. The archaeological record supports this view. Around 3200 BCE, there is a sudden decline across many early sites. Trade routes contract, settlements shrink, monumental construction halts. This event, known as the Uruk collapse, remains one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Some attribute it to climate change, droughts, shifting rivers, salinization of farmland. Others cite internal conflict or economic overstretch. But the speed and scale of the collapse suggest something deeper, a systemic failure that destabilized the entire region. What makes the Uruk collapse so troubling is not only its cause, but its aftermath. Within a few centuries, civilization re-emerges but altered. Writing evolves, religious structures shift, political systems fragment. It is as though the memory of the earlier world has been shaken loose and reassembled imperfectly. Some technologies vanish entirely, only to reappear much later. This cyclic pattern echoes the Sumerian worldview, the rise and fall of eras, the gain and loss of knowledge. Another layer of warning emerges when we consider the problem of language. The Sumerian language, a linguistic isolate with no known relatives, has puzzled scholars for over a century. Its structure is unlike any neighbouring language, and there is no clear evolutionary path tracing it back through earlier stages. It appears abruptly in the written record, already complex, already expressive. The lack of clear linguistic ancestors raises uncomfortable questions. If Sumerian did not evolve locally, then where did it come from? Was it brought by migrants who settled in Mesopotamia after the floods? Was it the remnant of a once widespread language family now lost? Or was it the sole survivor of a linguistic landscape wiped out by ancient catastrophe? Each possibility suggests a deeper fragility in human memory. If entire language families can vanish without a trace, leaving only one isolated descendant, then what else has been erased? What histories, traditions, and scientific knowledge might have disappeared with them? This fragility becomes even more apparent when we look at the earliest astronomical records. The Sumerians identified planets, tracked their movements, catalogued constellations, and divided the year with remarkable precision. Later civilizations inherited this knowledge from Babylon, which inherited it from earlier Sumerian traditions. But how did the Sumerians acquire it? Their earliest texts show astronomical knowledge that should have required centuries of continuous observation. Yet the archaeological record shows no long prehistory of Sumerian astronomical science. It simply appears abrupt, polished, systematic. Some scholars propose that earlier hunter-gatherer groups tracked the stars out of necessity, using them for navigation and seasonal planning. But hunter-gatherer astronomy rarely reaches the level of precision found in early Mesopotamian texts. Others suggest that priestly schools in Eridu or Uruk accumulated knowledge rapidly due to the demands of agricultural ritual. Yet this explanation does not account for the sophistication of the earliest documents. The possibility that the Sumerians inherited astronomical concepts from pre-flood or pre-agricultural cultures remains controversial, but cannot be dismissed outright. If there were earlier societies with advanced observational traditions, now lost due to catastrophic sea level rise, then the sudden emergence of Sumerian astronomy becomes less mysterious. In this scenario, the Sumerian texts are not the first chapter of human scientific knowledge, but the first surviving chapter, with earlier chapters erased. This theme, of surviving fragments from a ruptured past, is at the heart of the Sumerian warning. The warning is not about divine punishment or metaphysical prophecy. It is about the vulnerability of knowledge. It is about the thin line between continuity and oblivion. The tablets say it plainly. The wisdom of old was taken and they forgot. We do not know who they refers to. Perhaps the early humans who survived the floods. Perhaps the priests who rebuilt the cities. Perhaps humanity itself. The ambiguity is intentional, as though the Sumerians understood that forgetting is not a single event but a constant threat, a slow erosion of memory that begins the moment a civilization stops questioning its origins. One of the clearest expressions of this warning appears in the myth of the cedar forest. In the story, Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey to confront Humbaba, the guardian of the forest. Modern readers often focus on the heroic aspects of the tale, but beneath the adventure lies a somber theme: the destruction of a sacred place, the felling of ancient trees, the severing of a link between humanity and the primordial world. When Gilgamesh cuts down the forest, he wins glory but brings imbalance. The text emphasizes the irreversible nature of the act. What is lost will not be regained. The cedar forest may represent more than a literal forest. It may symbolize the old world, the world before the flood, before writing, before cities, a world of memory, intuition, and closeness to the divine. By cutting it down, Gilgamesh breaks the ancient continuity. The story functions as a warning. Progress can destroy the foundations upon which progress depends. This idea echoes across Sumerian lamentations. Time and again, destruction is portrayed not as random misfortune, but as the result of imbalance. Too much growth, too much noise, too much pride. When the gods send disasters, they do so not out of malice, but because the bonds of the world have become loose. The warning is simple. Civilization must maintain harmony with forces greater than itself, or collapse follows. But perhaps the most unsettling layer of the Sumerian warning involves the nature of humanity itself. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity is created to ease the labour of the gods. But as humans multiply, they become disruptive. Their clamour rises to heaven. In response, the gods impose limits on lifespan, fertility, and memory. The language is administrative, almost clinical. Human potential is not infinite, it is regulated. Modern readers often interpret this as mythic metaphor. Yet it invites a deeper interpretation, that the Sumerians perceived humanity as operating under constraints, biological, intellectual, spiritual, that did not arise naturally but were imposed. Whether by gods or by the consequences of the earlier disasters, humanity became less than it once was. This is the inverse of the modern narrative of progress. It suggests decline, not ascent. And it raises a disturbing question. If limitations were imposed, what was humanity before? The Sumerian texts do not answer. They hint, gesture, suggest. They speak of an earlier humanity with greater longevity, greater understanding, closer connection to the divine. The bright me of the black-headed people was taken, says one text, and they forgot. It is an echo of a lost chapter, a reminder that our origins may not lie where our written history begins. The warning embedded in these myths is not about gods or floods. It is about the fragility of memory, the cycles of rise and fall, the ease with which knowledge disappears. It whispers through every gap in the archaeological record, every missing artifact, every vanished language. And as we follow the traces left by the Sumerians, we find ourselves approaching the threshold of their greatest question. If humanity has forgotten so much, then what else remains hidden beneath the layers of time? What truths lie buried beneath the silt of ancient rivers, beneath the ruins of submerged coasts, beneath the fragments of myth preserved in clay? The Sumerians do not tell us. They invite us to look, to question, to search. And at the edge of their silence, the contours of a deeper story begin to emerge, one that may reshape everything we think we know about, where we come from, and where we are heading. There is a point somewhere near the end of the Sumerian story, when the silences grow louder than the words themselves, when the gaps in the clay, the myths left unfinished, and the ruins abandoned mid-construction begin to reveal more than any complete tablet ever could. By the time the last Sumerian scribes etched their cuneiform marks into wet clay, they were no longer writing as the confident record-keepers of the world's first cities, but as custodians of a memory that had already begun to fracture. Their texts feel different, more nostalgic, more fragile, more aware of what had been lost, and as their voices fade into the archaeological strata, they leave behind a final, lingering warning about humanity's origins, one that reaches beyond Sumer, beyond Mesopotamia, and into the deeper shadows of prehistory. It begins with an uncomfortable realization. The Sumerians themselves seemed unsure about the true beginning of their world. Their myths diverge. Their genealogies contradict one another. Their king lists stretch into impossible ages, then shrink abruptly after the flood, as though acknowledging two different realities, one ancient and expansive, the other constrained and familiar. The tension between these two worlds is not an inconsistency, but a clue. It hints that the Sumerians may have inherited memories from two different eras, the time before the Great Rupture and the time after. This rupture, symbolized by the flood, occupies a central place in their worldview, not merely as a destructive event but as a boundary between states of being. Before the flood, longevity, unity, and divine presence dominate the myths. After the flood, humanity becomes restless, short-lived, forgetful. The gods withdraw. Knowledge dims. Kingship no longer descends from heaven. It becomes a mortal institution. Something has changed, irrevocably. Modern research into early Holocene climate fluctuations reveals a similar division. Between 12,000 and 7,000 BCE, regions across the Near East experienced dramatic shifts. Melting glaciers, rising sea levels, massive freshwater floods, and atmospheric disturbances. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the sea. River courses changed. Ancient coastlines disappeared. If early humans lived along those coasts, as many anthropologists now suspect, Their settlements would lie today beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, the eastern Arabian shores, and whatever cultures existed there would have been destroyed, leaving only fragments carried inland by refugees. The Sumerians may have been their descendants. Their earliest cities lie near the edge of what was once a massive post-glacial flood basin, and their myths preserve memories of lands swallowed by the great waters, and cities lost beneath the noise of the storm. These are not casual metaphors. They are echoes, faint, distorted, but persistent, of events experienced by real people struggling to rebuild a world that had collapsed. If so, then the earliest Sumerian civilization was not the beginning of humanity's story, but the first surviving reconstruction. Their knowledge, their mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agriculture may reflect the remnants of an older tradition preserved by displaced groups who settled in Mesopotamia after the waters receded. This would explain why so much of Sumerian culture appears abruptly, fully formed. It would also explain why their myths speak of a time before with such reverence. But if Sumer was a reconstruction, what exactly had been lost? Here the Sumerian warning becomes more enigmatic. Their myths speak not only of physical destruction, but of a deeper rupture, the loss of a connection between humans and the cosmos. Before the flood, humans are portrayed as intimately bound to the divine order, capable of perceiving and interacting with beings who shaped the world. After the flood, this bond weakens. Communication becomes indirect. Ritual replaces dialogue. Memory replaces experience. In the Enuma Elish, the divine tablets of destiny, symbols of cosmic order, are stolen, fought over, lost and regained. Their fragility is emphasized. Order itself can be broken. In the Inanna cycle, wisdom is stored in the Abzu, the deep, hidden waters, then taken, scattered and partially recovered. In the Adapa myth, wisdom is given but immortality withheld, suggesting humanity once stood closer to a threshold it can no longer approach. These stories are not about morality. They are about disconnection, about a severing that reshaped human existence. This theme resonates with myths from distant cultures. Across the ancient world, from the Dogon in West Africa to the Hopi in North America to the Vedic hymns of India, there are stories of a time when humans could perceive what is now unseen. Gods, ancestors, cosmic forces, only to lose that capacity after a great disruption. Whether these tales reflect neurological changes, cultural shifts, or literal memories is unknown. But the pattern is too widespread to dismiss as coincidence. The Sumerians, however, add a distinct twist. They imply that the loss was not accidental. Something, whether divine will, natural catastrophe, or the consequence of human action, intervened to alter the trajectory of humanity. The Atrahasis epic states explicitly that human lifespan was shortened to prevent the world from being overwhelmed. The Ulmush Temple hymn speaks of rituals that once connected mortals to the sacred instructions, but no longer did. Another text laments that the eyes of the people have been dimmed, the old signs are forgotten. What were these signs? What exactly was forgotten? Archaeological evidence offers cryptic hints. Some of the earliest Sumerian tablets show symbols whose functions remain unknown. They may represent astronomical data, ritual algorithms, or schematic diagrams of cosmic cycles. A few scholars have suggested, cautiously, that certain markings resemble early attempts at mapping the heavens using geometric principles. Others notice parallels between Sumerian numerological tables and later Pythagorean and Babylonian systems. Still others observe that early Sumerian medical and botanical texts contain knowledge that appears far older than the cities themselves, as though copied from the earlier prototypes. The deeper one looks, the more it seems that Sumer preserved fragments of a lost intellectual world, and as these fragments reveal themselves, another pattern emerges. The knowledge is incomplete, pieces are missing, the context is lost. This incompleteness may be what the Sumerians were trying to warn about. They were not merely cataloguing myths or recounting cosmic dramas, they were documenting a rupture in human continuity, the break between the old world and the new. And they sensed, perhaps more than any later civilization, how fragile the reconstruction was. Their rituals reflect this anxiety. Many Sumerian ceremonies involve reenacting creation, not as celebration but as maintenance, as if the world itself needed periodic recalibration. The Akitu festival, for example, reenacts the founding of the order each year. The king is stripped of his symbols, humiliated, then reinstated after cosmic order is reaffirmed. This ritual humiliation is not about politics. It is about acknowledging that kingship, and by extension civilization, is not innate but bestowed, fragile, dependent on forces beyond human control. If Sumer inherited its civilization from an older world, then the rituals may represent attempts to preserve the memory of how that world functioned, a memory they feared would fade, and fade it did. By the time of the late 3rd millennium BCE, Sumer was sliding into decline. Environmental stress, salinization of farmland, shifting trade routes, and political fragmentation weakened the southern cities. Akkad rose and fell. The Gutians invaded. The Uther dynasty restored order briefly, only to collapse under its own weight. And through it all, the Sumerian scribes kept writing, laments, hymns, administrative records, each carrying a trace of the ancient worldview, even as the world around them changed. One of the most haunting texts from this era is the lamentation for Sumer and Ur. It describes not only the destruction of cities, but the disappearance of knowledge. Rituals lost, temples abandoned, the divine presence withdrawn. The lament speaks of the bonds between heaven and earth being cut, of the sacred words scattered, of the wisdom of the fathers forgotten. It is not merely a record of war, it is a requiem for a worldview. Yet the lament also contains a subtle reversal, an acknowledgement that what is lost might one day be remembered. The old paths will rise again, it says. The words will return when the time is right. This cryptic hope recurs across Mesopotamian literature. The idea that cycles of loss and recovery shape human history, that knowledge disappears, then re-emerges, is central to their cosmology. It echoes in later traditions across the ancient Near East, forming the backbone of esoteric schools that claim to preserve fragments of primordial wisdom. Whether or not such claims are accurate, they reflect a deep instinct shared across cultures, the sense that humanity is not moving in a straight line but in a spiral, losing and regaining truths, repeating patterns, navigating cycles far older than written memory. This spiraling sense of time casts a new light on the Sumerian warning. Perhaps they were not warning of a single event, not a flood or a collapse or a divine withdrawal, but of the pattern itself, the pattern of forgetting, the pattern of rebuilding without understanding, the pattern of inheriting fragments without context. If that is the case, then the true warning is not about the past at all. It is about the future. For the Sumerians understood something that modern societies often overlook, that knowledge, no matter how advanced, can erode, that civilizations, no matter how powerful, can vanish, that memory, no matter how carefully preserved, can fade. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a broken chain, custodians of incomplete truths, and they feared that future civilizations would suffer the same fate, that the cycle would repeat, that the losses would deepen, that humanity would drift further from its origins. This fear takes on new meaning when we consider how much of early human history remains obscured. Entire regions that once may have held ancient cultures are submerged beneath seas. Vast deserts conceal ruins yet to be uncovered. Oral traditions that carried pre-literate memory have been lost. Genetic and linguistic evidence hints at migration waves and population bottlenecks that we still do not fully understand. In that sense, the Sumerian warning is not a relic of the past, but a mirror held up to the present. How much of our own story do we truly know? How much has been lost, not through malice, but through the quiet erosion of time? And what will remain of us in 5,000 years? What fragments of our knowledge will survive, and what misunderstandings will future civilizations inherit? The Sumerians did not answer these questions. They asked them, indirectly, through myth, through ritual, through the careful preservation of stories that no longer had a clear interpretation. Their texts end not with certainty, but with empty spaces, broken lines, missing tablets. And in those silences, the weight of their warning becomes heavier. For the final Sumerian message may be this, that the greatest mysteries are not in the origins themselves, but in the forgetting. That humanity's true story lies not only in what we have discovered, but in what we once knew and have lost. And that somewhere, beneath the layers of clay, beneath the sediments of time, beneath the ruins of vanished worlds, a deeper memory waits, patient, fragmented, calling softly to those willing to listen. And as we lean close to those broken tablets, listening for echoes across millennia, a final question rises, quiet and unsettling. If the Sumerians were trying to warn us that humanity has forgotten its beginnings, what else, buried deeper still, have we yet to remember?